To understand Benedictine monasticism and how it applies to our lives in the 21st century, it is important to understand where Christian monasticism came from. By the time Benedict wrote his rule in the 6th century, he was building on the foundation of 300 years of earlier monastic men and women who had pioneered this way of seeking God above all else. In the first 3 centuries after Christ, the Christian religion was seen as a threat to the existing political and social order. Christians refused to worship the Roman emperor and were thus seen as a threat, and their religion was outlawed. The early martyrs were believers who refused to disavow their faith in the face of persecution and paid the ultimate price with their lives. In the early centuries, to be a Christian meant being someone who was on the margins, practicing a faith that made them subject to persecution and even death. Christians were socially marginalized, failing to follow the predominant culture of the times. All this began to change quickly and radically in the early 4th century with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine to Christianity and the subsequent legalization of the Christian faith. Suddenly, being a Christian changed from being something that could make a person liable to be persecuted or even killed, to a faith and practice that was condoned by no less than the emperor himself. Very quickly, the world of the Christian believer was turned upside down. To understand the origins of Christian monasticism, it is crucial to understand what this shift would have felt like to Christians and non-Christians alike in the 4th century. For people of this era who had been pagans, believers in the traditional Roman gods, the conversion of the emperor to put Christianity in a whole new light. Whereas before, Christianity may have seemed like an odd, distasteful religion that appealed to people on the edges of society, things suddenly changed. To the politically or socially ambitious citizen of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, converting to the new religion of the emperor would have seemed quite politically expedient. There was no longer any real cost to becoming a Christian. There were no more persecutions. Instead, Christianity seemed to be the new wave of the future, an easy way to rise in society. But what happened to the Christians who had endured persecution, who had converted out of deep conviction, or who had been raised in families with a legacy of Christian belief? In the 4th century, these Christians would have had clear memories of fellow believers who had sacrificed everything for their faith. Now, with the changes in society, belief was something easy and socially acceptable. Christ's admonition to pay the price of faith, to take up the cross and follow him, could no longer be followed literally. For many Christians, this meant that there was no longer any way to truly emulate Christ, to risk everything for Christ their Lord. How does one take up the cross when the cross has become an emblem of popular religion, rather than something that could represent the loss of one's life for their faith? For the believers who wanted to test themselves to the limit, who did not want an easy, politically expedient faith, they began to go to the desert, primarily in Egypt, but also in places like Syria and Palestine. By going to the desert, these Christians were rejecting a faith that no longer had any real cost, that was now easy and acceptable. Going to the desert meant testing oneself, no longer risking the loss of physical life, but pushing oneself to the limit. The martyrs of the early church had suffered red martyrdom, the martyrdom of blood, of physical death. These desert Christians were beginning to practice white martyrdom, giving up their life in the world, the life of easy faith. Their way of life would be the way of asceticism, the way of giving up easy pleasures for the discipline and practice of a deeper, more challenging faith. In the desert, nothing could be taken for granted. Not food, not water, not belongings, not companionship. In the desert, they would spare nothing in the practice of their faith. Intense regimens of prayer, fasting, silence, and solitude would help them enter into the call to become like Christ, to be remade in his image. This asceticism is different from the modern understanding of asceticism as giving up pleasure out of some kind of desire for self-mortification. The root of the Christian Greek word for asceticism means to train as an athlete. These early monks of the desert were spiritual athletes. They wanted to discipline themselves spiritually in the way an athlete does in training for a sporting event. Their practices of constant prayer, living alone in the wilderness, going out with sufficient food and water and sleep, was a way to focus on their relationship with God, to reject what they saw as the laziness and self-indulgence of the world, and instead focusing on being transformed in faith. An important practice of the lives of these early monks was submitting to the guidance of a wise elder, someone more mature in the faith. These wise elders, the abbas or fathers, or ammas, mothers, would provide advice for their disciples. These abbas and ammas were not teachers with a set curriculum, but guides who could read the hearts of their disciples and offer them personal advice. The advice that these early abbas and ammas gave to others has come down to us through the centuries and has been preserved in various forms. The wisdom of these elders was usually short, pithy, and personal. An abba or amma would give a teaching designed to cut directly to the key issue that a disciple was dealing with. They would focus on core disciplines in unadorned ways. Two short examples of these sayings are, a brother came to Scetus to visit Abba Moses and asked him for a word. The old man said to him, "Go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." Or another one, Abba Macarius was asked, "How should one pray?" The old man said, "There is no need at all to make long discourses. It is enough to stretch out one's hands and say, 'Lord, as you will and as you know, have mercy.' And if the conflict grows fiercer, say, 'Lord, help.' He knows very well what we need, and he shows us his mercy." Another key theme in the early desert is how the early monks prayed and centered their life on Scripture. The culture of the desert monks was a culture rooted in Scripture. Monks memorized large portions of Scripture and recited the Psalms as a regular prayer practice. They meditated with Scripture and used it to teach, encourage, and admonish one another. This was not a culture of priests and sacraments for the most part. The Word in Scripture and not the sacraments were central to their lives. In their prayer, they tried to emulate the Apostle Paul's admonition to pray without ceasing. They did this primarily through the use of Scripture. Benedict's later emphasis on the Psalms as the heart of both communal and personal prayer is rooted in this desert tradition. At this point, we need to make an important distinction between different types of monks. Some monks of the early desert were hermits, living completely alone. Many monks, especially in the area known as Lower Egypt, were what historians call semi-eremitical. This means that they would live within an area where they could gather fairly regularly for mutual support and worship. These are the monks who are the most well-known and whose sayings have come down to us through the centuries. In the area known as Upper Egypt, the predominant mode of monasticism was Cenobitic. Cenobitic means that these monks lived together in a community setting rather than independently. The key figure in this early Cenobitic tradition is a monk named Pachomius. This is important because we will see that it is the Cenobitic tradition that Benedict follows, and it is the tradition that came to predominate in the West. Another key element of this Cenobitic form of monasticism is that for the first time we begin to see the idea of a written rule or common written prescriptions for living this monastic way of life. As we will see, this idea of a rule becomes the basis for Benedictine monasticism.